What we want to discuss today is the mass incarceration levels in the United States, as well as the tough-on-crime legislation favored by not only conservatives, but a certain stripe of politician everywhere. And since spending time in a U.S. federal prison, you've become a very vocal critic of mass incarceration in the United States.
I was fairly critical of it before, but particularly after I'd experienced it.
Yeah, what was it about your experience that you found most illustrative of wider problems with the way the U.S. legal system actually functions?
Well, like many other people that I met there, I more committed crimes than you did. I mean, my greatest grievance is not with the prison system, although, and not my personal treatment of it, but the way the system operates. I mean, the prosecutors have a conviction rate of 99.5%, 97% without a trial. And the reason for that is that the variance between pleading guilty and the sentence you get if you do that, and not pleading guilty and being convicted, which almost always happens, is so great that people are intimidated. And the reason that people are practically always convicted is because the plea bargain system has been so distorted and corrupted that what happens in practice is that the prosecutors target somebody. They go around to that person's 8 closest acquaintances in the activity objected to and say, we want whatever evidence you can recall that will prove that Mr. X committed a crime. And when the 8 people say, I don't believe that he did, I have no such evidence, I know him, he's an honest man, he wouldn't do that. They say, well, that's all very nice, but if you don't jog your memory, then clearly a conspiracy to obstruct justice by the withholding of evidence is in progress, and you will be complicit in it and will be charged. Whereupon, almost invariably, people have hitherto unrecollected remembrances of the guilty conduct of the targeted individual, and they, as in a catechism class, are rehearsed in however many sessions with the prosecutors it takes to get satisfactory evidence. Then they are given an immunity, including against accusations of perjury, and file in like a row of trained seals and sink whoever the target is. And if that's how the system operates, you're going to convict everybody you accuse. And that's effectively what happens. And so the result is that the United States has, as you know, from 6 to 12 times the number of incarcerated people per capita of its peer group of prosperous democratic countries, which is generally reckoned to be large prosperous democracies, which is generally reckoned to be Australia, Canada, France, Germany, Japan, and the United Kingdom.
What provides the incentive for such a high level of prosecution? Because one would think that from any perspective, discovering someone's innocence or discovering that the so-called crime they've committed is far less serious than originally thought would be a positive outcome for civil society at large. Why are people so incentivized to ensure these skyrocketing conviction levels?
Well, in fairness, I don't think that's how it's presented to the American public. In the first place, we're all unlicensed psychiatrists, but I have no standing to impute motives to people, in particular, in your question, to the motives of the majority of people in a huge country, a complicated society of over 300 million people. But the prevailing political wind has been, for a long time, crack down on the criminals and treat them harshly and reduce their number. And that has, I believe that really took hold in the 60s with the fears generated, on the one hand, by radical African Americans, including riots at Attica and San Quentin and certain much publicized groups that frighten society to a degree, like the Black Panthers, and secondly, the feminist movement that, depending on which spokesperson you listen to, created the impression that there were an inordinate number of potential rapists in the male population. And so politically, it was a free lunch. And what you said in your introduction was absolutely correct. Robert Kennedy and Nelson Rockefeller were just as hard-line in things like 3 strikes and you're out, mandatory minimums, and that sort of thing, as Richard Nixon or Ronald Reagan. And it was a uniform consensus. And there was no constituency for the other side. The old legal reform movement, the penal reform movement that exists in all these civilized countries, that certainly exists in Canada, John Howard Society and so forth, was squashed by this mighty juggernaut of everyone from left to right saying we're going to stop mollycoddling criminals, and it has taken a very long time for the incidences of abuse of prosecutorial office to aggregate themselves up to the point where the media and therefore the public are starting to become seriously concerned about them. And this is happening at the same time that inefficient government management is creating serious concerns about the cost of the prison system. And much of the agitation, even by Newt Gingrich and so on, for a less imprisonment-based system, it's commendable, and indeed it's correct as far as it goes, but the motive is much more one of cost efficiency than of these prosecutors are out of control, and they think they can take down whoever they want for as long as they want. And I thought in the year when my friend Scooter Libby, the former chief of staff to the vice president of the U.S., Mr. Cheney, was convicted on evidence that the chief cooperating witness has now stated was absolutely false. And she's made allegations which, if true, would cause the prosecutor in the case, it was the same prosecutor I had, Patrick Fitzgerald, to be disbarred in this country here, Great Britain. And in the same year as the Libby case, Senator Ted Stevens of Alaska, 7-term senator, very prominent member of the U.S. Senate, was convicted on evidence that was almost immediately proved to be false, and there was no sanction on the prosecutors there. Now, one of them tragically committed suicide. No one would be asking for that, but there was no other sanction on the prosecutors other than censorious remarks that were published. Well, the prosecutors can just fabricate evidence, withhold evidence, and do what they want to get a conviction, and nothing happens to disincentivize them from abusing the system. There's going to be a terrible amount of abuse. I'll finish this monologue, which I apologize for the length of, but it's a complicated subject. Mm-hmm. The Johnson case, I mean, it's, of course, one of the most common names in the U.S., so in itself it doesn't mean much, but the actual case I'm referring to was a southern states, a Mississippi case, I think, where a Mr. Johnson was convicted of first-degree murder, and he was on death row for 14 years, but he kept using the legal aid system to appeal his conviction and prolong the period between sentencing and carrying out the sentence, and which was the death penalty. And it finally came to light that throughout this 14-year period, the prosecution was perfectly aware of DNA evidence that exonerated him, and he was exonerated. And he sued for wrongful prosecution and wrongful imprisonment, and he won, and the state appealed, and Johnson won the appeal, and the award was $1 million for every year that he was on death row, $14 million. And went to the Supreme Court, throwing out 5-4 by the great conservative majority in that court, and their decision was that what was done was undoubtedly shameful, but that the prosecutors were acting in their functions, and any sanction on them would have to be taken by the local bar. Now, I don't know, for all I know, the bar of Mississippi may have done something. I wouldn't know that, but I guess, obviously, I suppose I should find out, but I think that's beside the point. The real issue here is that if prosecutors can deliberately attempt for 14 years to send a man they know to be innocent to his death, then whether they're disbarred as a result of it or not is really beside the point. It is a very unbalanced system.
And so you mentioned the recourse that was sought by Johnson. And people like you actually have the means to seek recourse for false prosecution. From what I understand, from what you've been saying, most people don't have that recourse, don't have the financial means available to them.
Most people don't have the means to fight them at all. American lawyers are, for the most part, extremely avaricious. This is not something that's confined to the United States. I have to say that I think to varying degrees in all of our Western societies, the legal profession is conducting a cartel, and it is in some respects an abusive cartel. Now, it's certainly a learned profession, and there are many extremely capable lawyers, but there is a fundamental ability to abuse the system by a very powerful and coherent group when lawyers make the laws and the regulations and legislate them and judge them and argue them. And they have every stage of the operation, and they swaddle it all in this sanctimonious claptrap about the rule of law being all that separates us from the jungle and lower orders of animals and so forth. And I mean, look, there's some truth to that. Of course, we have to have a society of laws, and the rule of law. But they're using it as a cover for an endless production of more and more laws and regulations requiring the endless graduation and accreditation of more and more lawyers, between them all taking up a larger and larger share of public activity and gross domestic product. And the legal profession consumes about 10% of the GDP of the United States, a larger percent than is consumed by health care. And people can't afford it. They are very expensive. I only say this because it's a matter of public record. My legal bills were over $30 million. Now, some of them were in Canada and two countries together, but I had some indemnities. I had to sue to enforce them, so I recovered about half of that. But obviously, that is not an amount of money that most people can afford to pay.
Right. And you've written extensively on your time in prison in your memoir, and one of the things that I was quite interested by is when you discuss the quote quality of the inmates that you met, how you were shocked by how some of them were, as you put it, objectively dodgy people. Many of them were very recoverable and should not have been given the sentences that they did. What are a few examples of people you met that were incarcerated for very long amounts of time for crimes that you once compared to, it's the equivalent of chopping someone's hand off for stealing a loaf of bread, I believe you said?
Yeah. Well, one of my students got a 20-year sentence for driving a truck full of marijuana. Now, he knew that it was an illegal substance. He himself was not a user, not a dealer. He said he was merely a driver. And leaving aside the fact that marijuana has been legalized in 2 states, and because our governments can't finance themselves properly, when they see the money in it, they're going to legalize it everywhere, just as we had the evolution of the gambling issue from how we could not possibly allow the innocent working man to be deprived of his income in a casino to the fact fact, we're soon going to have them virtually on every block because the government needs the money, and they're afraid to raise taxes for good reason. But leaving aside whether I think marijuana should be an illegal substance or not, which I do not, but fine, that was the law. The man broke the law. But 20 years for driving a truck with marijuana? I mean, that is, to use the example you raised, I mean, it's, of course, not quite the same as chopping someone's hand off, but it's a very severe sentence. It was nonsense. Anyway, he wasn't a bad man. I got to know my students quite well, and they tended to tell me a lot about their lives. And this was not a man who belonged in prison at all. He was no danger to anyone, and that when released, he would get uncontroversial work and be a productive member of society. And that has, I'm happy to say, that has in fact happened. I keep in touch with some of these people, and that's what he's doing. He has a modest job as a salesperson in a sporting goods store in Florida, and he's fine.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting evidence that's come out stating that the stigma of a criminal record, often for very small infractions, when they exit prison, they often feel like they have no choice but to go back to crime due to the lack of employment opportunities for them.
Is that a question?
Well, I was wondering if that had been your experience talking to the people that you served with.
It's a problem. I mean, my situation is a bit different, so I can't say it's been a problem for me. But but yes, it is a problem, but it's really a part of a larger problem, and that is that a great many of these people got into the activities that led to them being prosecuted and convicted. And we're speaking of the ones who actually did break the law. And my reckoning is about 20% of incarcerated people in the U.S. are innocent, but and almost all the others are over sentenced. But I'm speaking of the non-violent ones now. The violent ones, that's another issue, and I had almost no experience with those people. They weren't in the kind of low security place where I was. But it's not just the stigma. It is that while you're there, they don't really teach you anything that enables you to earn a livable income in an honest way. Let's just say an illegal way. I remember once one of the people I knew there said, "Are you going to the visitor center today?" And I said, "Well, I am, in fact," and indeed I went most days because I had a lot of visitors. But most of you can only receive them 4 days a week, and so I often I used almost all those days. But the man asked me this. He said, "Well, my son's coming to visit me, and he wants to become a drug dealer," which I did, which is why I'm here. And I'm trying to dissuade him of that. Could I bring him over to talk to you and just try and tell him it's not a great idea? So I did, and I said, the argument I thought of, I said, look, if you're attracted to that sort of milieu, that kind of demi-monde of those people, and some people are, a lot of lawyers are, by the way, a lot of police are, they find it kind of fascinating little society in a way. I said, why don't you become a bail bondsman? You're taking money out of the same pool. You're seeing all these people. You make quite a secure, good income, but it's completely legal, and the police won't bother you, and the prosecutors won't bother you. And in the end, that's what this guy did. He became a bail bondsman, which is a terrible occupation, I think, but if you like that kind of underclass, under society, and want to have some association with it, that's a way of doing it without doing anything illegal. But if they would, you see, the problem is in the U.S., a good part of the prison industry is in private hands. Companies like Correction Corporation of America, Wackenhut, and so forth. And even the state and federal prisons are, like any bureaucracy, sort of a vast organization, and in the private sector as in the public sector, all these organizations like to grow, and in this case, the commodity is prisoners. So they want more prisoners. So they want more people prosecuted, more grounds to prosecute them, and longer sentences. And when they finally have to release them, they want the maximum possibility that they will be flopped back into the system, because they, it's like a man, for argument's sake, building automobiles, making automobiles. He wants to make and sell more automobiles. Well, they want more prisoners. And the system is sort of skewed that way, and they don't really, they pretend they do, but they don't really help people to acquire skills that will enable them when they leave to make an income legally that they can live on. And that, by the way, is one of the great problems of the Harper government's omnibus crime bill. And they were rolling back the rehabilitative and job training aspects of it, and especially in periods of relatively high unemployment, which was the case when I was in prison in the United States. It's come down now, but all the traditional forces that represent and act for relatively unskilled labor agitate not to get more competition from people who, for their own purposes, they represent as incorrigible criminals, morally unfit to be employed. So it's an economic as well as a how should I put it, an economic problem, a psychological problem, and a problem aggravated by the appetite of the prison industry not to return these people to society fully able to function in it, but rather to return them temporarily and snatch them back if they can.
Right, and this is very interesting because you mentioned previously how politicians present the tough on crime legislation, and we've seen that a lot of people don't particularly want to challenge the underlying assumptions of tough on crime because they don't want to be seen as being soft on crime. They don't want to be seen as the kinds of people who let rapists back out onto the street near schools and things like that, and they're fearful the opposition will paint them that way. So when politicians say that severe sentencing and 3 strikes and you're out and those types of laws are necessary to deter crime, what is your response to that?
Well, as I've said, first of all, I make a distinction between violent crime and nonviolent crime.
Mm-hmm.
There is absolutely no question that society has to be, to the maximum degree possible, protected from habitually violent people.
Right.
And dealing with those people once they're justly convicted is a very much more complicated problem than the kind of thing I was talking about. And I understand why there is a sensitivity amongst politicians about being accused of allowing those who might rape or kill or do anything threatening violence to release them prematurely. But I think that has to be discussed in a different context. But 20-year sentences for nonviolent people, with maybe a few exceptions, like a horribly grandiose crime like the Madoff case, for example,
right,
is just nonsense. I mean, it doesn't achieve any desirable objective for society in general. It merely whets the appetite of this voracious prison system to have more people in it. So it's a bigger business to run, paying higher salaries to the management and throwing out bigger kickbacks from the suppliers. And if you're buying 1 million mattresses a year instead of 500,000 mattresses a year, you get more preferments from the people you buy the mattresses from. But and don't imagine that the system doesn't work that way in the U.S. I mean, every head of the Bureau of Prisons is fired after a few years for some misfeasance or other. It's quite a corrupt organization. And I keep finding, when I was there, they're constantly finding things that have been smuggled in. Well, it's impossible for a visitor to to smuggle in anything to someone they're visiting. It all comes in through corrupt prison officials who sell it and supplement their incomes with it. But that's a slight digression. I think that there is no great pressure on politicians to say that nonviolent people have to be sent away for maximum sentence. Unfortunately, we got distracted with this nonsense of the war on drugs. It has been a total failure. The United States, when it actually engages in a real war, a military war, normally does very well, and its military are very successful, well-trained, and very well-armed.
Right.
But these phony wars, the war on crime, the war on poverty, these seizures, arrogations to themselves by politicians of the word war, with all that implies in terms of national unity behind a cause, seeking an absolute victory for things that are not susceptible to that sort of treatment, is nonsense. I mean, there was a total war against Japan after they attacked Pearl Harbor, and it was a just war, and the Japanese had no business attacking Pearl Harbor and killing thousands of Americans. And but that isn't like the war on drugs. I mean, the fact is, the whole concept is nonsense, and they've stoked up civil wars in parts of Latin America. And as with prohibition in the 20s, they've handed over this large industry to extremely disreputable elements. But if you legalized soft drugs and legalized hard drugs with a requirement for addicts to submit to treatment, and if they declined to do it, took them into custody and administered treatment to them humanely, you would take that business out of the hands of criminal elements, and you would add greatly to the revenues of the governments, and you'd radically reduce the cost of conducting this insane war if in any case has been lost. I mean, we now have drug busts in Mexico where both sides have helicopter gunships, and eventually the target people escape in submarines and things like this. I mean, it's like a real war. And it's all nonsense. But it just goes on because the media haven't got around to informing the public that the whole thing is a scam anyway. But it is. So if you just took out the soft drug and nonviolent element of those convicted in the so-called drug war, you'd move out, I would think, probably a third of the incarcerated people in the U.S. If you train them to do something before you release them, then I accept it would increase pressure on some categories of job holders in that country, but it would add very substantially to the hireable and functioning, economically useful part of the population, and would be a good thing in all respects.
But as you point out, like, a lot of these issues are quite complex, and complex issues
they are, and I don't mean to speak of them simplistically. Mm-hmm. But what I said is not so complicated. Once you get into questions of violence related to drugs and that sort of thing, it gets very complicated, and you have to be extremely careful, and there are no easy answers to it.
But the key is,
that is not the number of violent people in American prisons. It's higher than other countries, but it's nothing like the imbalance of the total confined population. If they've just adopted the rule, all right, we're going to release all the nonviolent people over a phased program here, depending on the gravity of their offense, but we're not really changing the regime on violent people, or threatened by a point and that sort of thing. You would address a large part of the problem of the statistical imbalance of incarcerated people per capita in the U.S. comparative to the countries that it's fair to compare it to. I mean, you wouldn't compare it to a failed state like Somalia or something. You've got to compare it to a prosperous democratic country, and a large country with a a varied economy and population, not a petro-state like Kuwait or something like that.
One final question then is, so for our listeners, a lot of people are hearing these issues getting broken down, as you say, in quite an understandable and simple fashion. Well, what does this mean in terms of real policy? What sorts of things, for example, here in Canada, could be implemented to reach a system that is more just and runs more along the lines of what you've been talking about?
Well, the reforms I'd recommend are, I agree with the present government's plan to legalize marijuana. I would legalize all drugs on the basis I said, but the people all those who have given reason in their past conduct to justify suspicion that they are addicts of hard drugs would have to submit to tests to see if they are. And if they are, they have to submit to treatment. And if they don't, they have to be taken into a gentle form of custody where they have to undergo the treatment. That I would agree with. Or at least that's what I would advocate. For the rest, I would let them go legalize the business, but regulate it. Regulate the sale of marijuana as the sale of alcoholic beverages is, and urge the governments to take the revenue and use the revenue wisely, and if possible, use it to lower taxes on modest income families and small businesses, but in any case, benefit from the revenue. And I would reverse course on what the Harper government did and increase skills training, job training, and generally rehabilitative treatment. And I was asked to give talks, as a number of my colleagues were, to inmates who were about to be released and give them advice, even though I was asked to do it when my own release wasn't imminent. But I hadn't won my appeal to the Supreme Court at that point. And I did do a bit of research on it, and there are some industries that don't pay much attention to your legal history. For example, most elements of the oil industry, by which I mean the extraction of oil, I don't mean executives in the offices of great oil companies. I mean, in the oil fields or in offshore oil rigs, they don't really care anything about that, and they pay quite an impressive wage. And so that's an area to go. There are various types of work that are less interested in that kind of thing. But I think we have to be much more demanding, have much more public expression by serious figures of authority of the old view that when people are convicted of something and are sentenced to some state of either some state of penalization anyway of one kind or another, and have paid that sentence, done that sentence, whatever it is. Then that does, the old expression, it's a sort of trite and absurd in a way, but of paying one's debt to society. At that point, the slate is supposed to be wiped clean.
Right.
It isn't supposed to continue for the rest of their lives with no possibility of them ever being looked upon as decent, functioning, respectable members of society. And that has to end. I mean, if it is not a heinous crime, if it is an infraction of a sort that doesn't threaten anyone's life or well-being, but is a violation of the law with intent to break the law on a scale that carries a criminal penalty, and the penalty is paid satisfactorily, and the person is released, then that person has to be, again, given the benefit of the doubt of anyone else of being a reasonable and sociable person. Sociable in the sense of unthreatening to society. I don't mean in the sense of being particularly gregarious. Mm-hmm. And we just have to resurrect these ancient concepts. We went completely off the dock into the deep end in this theory that anyone who picked off a 5-cent cigar on his way out of a drugstore or something was scarred for life as a dangerous felon. And we just got to stop that and reverse it. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying mollycoddle criminals. I'm all for having sensible laws and enforcing them. And those who, I'm for the punishment of crime and the repentance of wrongdoing. But I'm not for the over-punishment of minor offenses.
Well, Mr. Black, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
My pleasure. Nice speaking to you.